The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over Greenwood Park, where families gathered every weekend to enjoy the outdoors. Laughter echoed from the playground, where children ran freely, their carefree joy filling the air. Among them, Mark Thompson, a black father in his mid-30s, watched his daughter Lily with a smile on his face as she dashed between the swings and the monkey bars. She was a bundle of energy, her bright blonde curls bouncing with every step. Mark chuckled as Lily called for him, her voice high-pitched and full of excitement. "Daddy, watch me," she cried out, her little legs pumping as she tried to race him to the slide. He ran after her, not too fast, letting her win. Lily shrieked with joy as she reached the top, her grin wide, showing off her missing front tooth. From a nearby bench, Sarah Mitchell sipped her iced coffee, her brow furrowed as she observed the scene. Sarah was a fixture in the community. She volunteered at the local church, helped organize neighborhood events, and considered herself a protector of sorts. She was always on alert, always watching. Today, something about Mark and Lily caught her attention. It wasn't their playfulness, nor the love and care he clearly showed for his daughter. It was the stark contrast between them. Mark's dark skin and Lily's light complexion didn't seem to fit in her mind. Is she really his daughter? Sarah thought, the question creeping in unbidden. Her mind quickly constructed scenarios, each one more far-fetched than the last. She shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her eyes narrowing. Lily raced back toward Mark, her laughter echoing as he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy. She rested her head on his shoulder, her small arms wrapped around his neck, while Mark gently kissed her forehead. It was a moment of pure love between father and daughter, but to Sarah, something felt wrong. The gnawing feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. "Maybe I should say something," Sarah muttered under her breath, glancing around. Other parents seemed unfazed, laughing and playing with their own kids. She told herself that she was just being cautious, looking out for the safety of a child. After all, what harm could it do to be careful? As Lily darted off to the swings, Mark settled onto a nearby bench to catch his breath. He watched her, his eyes filled with love, while around him the park buzzed with life. Parents chatted, couples strolled hand in hand, and dogs barked happily at passing squirrels. Everything seemed peaceful. But not for Sarah. Sipping her drink, Sarah's thoughts grew darker. Why would a little white girl be with a black man like that? It just doesn't seem right, she thought, the words echoing in her mind. She glanced at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. For a moment, she hesitated, thinking she might be overreacting. But then, Lily tripped while running and fell, letting out a yelp as she hit the ground. Sarah's heart jumped. She stood up quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. Mark was already at Lily's side, his hands moving gently over her legs as he checked for any injuries. She was fine, just a scraped knee. He picked her up, brushing off the dirt from her dress and whispering soothing words that only a parent could offer. But Sarah wasn't watching the tender care Mark showed Lily. She saw something else entirely. Her mind, clouded by years of unexamined prejudice, painted a different picture. What if the girl was in danger? What if she didn't belong to him? Her fingers trembled as she tapped the number for the police. "I need to report something suspicious," she whispered into the phone, her heart racing. Mark, unaware of the storm brewing behind him, continued to comfort his daughter. He hugged her close, letting her tears dry on his shoulder. The world was still warm and safe for him and Lily, but that peace wouldn't last for long. Mark stood up from the bench, still holding Lily close as her sniffles quieted. He kissed the top of her head, rubbing her back gently. "You're a tough one, Lily," he said softly, trying to bring a smile back to her tear-streaked face. "Just a little scrape, see? You're going to be okay." Lily looked up at him with big, watery eyes, but a small grin began to tug at her lips. She wiped her nose on her sleeve and gave him a nod. "Can we go get ice cream after this?" she asked, her voice still a little shaky. "Of course," Mark smiled, relieved that her spirits were already lifting. "We'll get the biggest cone they have. Double scoops." As Mark settled back onto the bench with Lily on his lap, he let out a deep breath. It had been a good day so far, despite the small fall. They needed more days like this, just the two of them, laughing, playing, enjoying the sunshine. Mark was always aware of how people looked at them, the curious stares and raised eyebrows from strangers. He knew the looks were because of the contrast in their skin tones, but he never let it bother him. His love for Lily outweighed any judgment from the outside world. But Sarah, standing a few yards away with her phone pressed to her ear, wasn't thinking about love. Her voice was hushed but urgent as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher. "There's a man here with a little girl. I don't think she's safe." "Yes, I'm at Greenwood Park," she said, glancing nervously at Mark and Lily. "He's black and she's white. I just have a bad feeling. You need to send someone quickly." The dispatcher on the other end asked more questions, but Sarah's mind was racing too fast to focus on the details. She kept watching Mark, who was now helping Lily back onto her feet, her scraped knee seemingly forgotten as she skipped off toward the swings again. Mark waved at her and called out, "Don't go too high, Lil." For a moment, Sarah's hand faltered, and she wondered if she had done the right thing. She had seen them playing, heard their laughter, and witnessed how gently he cared for her. But still, there was something in her gut that told her this wasn't right. Maybe she was being overly cautious, or maybe she was seeing things that weren't there. But what if she wasn't? What if something terrible was happening and she did nothing? The thought was unbearable. Her gaze flicked toward the entrance of the park, where the distant wail of sirens could already be heard. Her stomach tightened, realizing that once the police arrived, there would be no turning back. She watched as the officers' cars pulled up near the curb. A couple of families turned their heads to look at the scene, murmuring in confusion as the uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles. Mark, still on the bench, didn't notice them at first. He was too busy watching Lily, now laughing on the swings, her legs pumping hard to push herself higher. He smiled at her joy, momentarily forgetting the world around him. "Sir," one of the officers called, approaching him with a serious expression. "Can we speak with you for a moment?" Mark looked up, surprised to see the police standing in front of him, his brow furrowed in confusion as he stood up, his body instinctively tensing. Sure. Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. The officer glanced over at Lily, who was still swinging happily, oblivious to what was happening. "We received a call about a potential situation here. Can you explain your relationship to that child?" Mark blinked, taken aback. His eyes darted to Lily and back to the officer, realization beginning to dawn on him. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his cool as he replied, "That's my daughter, Lily." The officer's expression didn't change. "Do you have any identification, sir? Any documentation to prove your relationship?" Mark's heart sank. He had been through this before, not often, but enough to know how these things could escalate. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Yeah, I've got her adoption papers in here somewhere," he said, his voice steady but tight with frustration. "I always carry them, just in case." As he fumbled through his wallet, he could feel the eyes of the other parents at the park turning toward him. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, and more people gathered at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Sarah stood frozen by the tree, her phone still in her hand, her heart pounding. She could see the tension in Mark's posture, the way he handled the situation with care, but also with a certain weariness. As if this was not the first time he had been questioned like this. Doubt began to creep in, her certainty from moments ago beginning to falter. Had she made a mistake? Mark handed over the adoption papers to the officer, who inspected them carefully. His hands were still, but inside, his emotions were roiling. He hated this. He hated that he had to carry proof of his love for his daughter, like some sort of permit. He hated that strangers, simply because of their biases, could call into question the legitimacy of his family. The officer handed the papers back, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, sir. Just doing our job," he said, though the words did little to ease the tension. He nodded toward Lily, who was now slowing down on the swings, her eyes beginning to dart toward the gathering crowd. "It looks like everything checks out. We'll be on our way." Mark gave a short nod, his jaw tight as he tried to maintain his composure. "Yeah, sure, thanks," he muttered, his eyes following the officers as they turned to leave. But he could feel the weight of the stares on him, the judgment hanging in the air. even after the police were gone. Sarah stayed rooted in place, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked her phone back into her bag. She watched as Mark walked over to Lily, scooping her up in his arms and whispering something in her ear. The girl giggled, unaware of the storm that had just passed, but Sarah couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest. Had she misread the situation entirely? As Mark began to gather their things, preparing to leave the park, Sarah took a step forward, her voice catching in her throat. She wasn't sure if she should say something, apologize, or just disappear. But as the police cars pulled away, the full weight of what she had done began to sink in. Mark held Lily close as they walked toward their car, his mind racing despite the calm front he was trying to maintain. He glanced over his shoulder, watching the police cars disappear down the street. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with a situation like this, but it never got easier. The quiet weight of suspicion and judgment was always there, lingering in the air, as if his very presence needed justification. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after the officers had left. As they reached the car, Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, why were the police talking to you?" Mark paused for a moment, his heart sinking. He knelt down so that he was eye level with her, brushing a curl away from her face. "They just wanted to ask me some questions, sweetheart. Everything's okay now." Lily tilted her head, her big eyes searching his face. "Are they going to come back?" "No," Mark said, forcing a smile. "No, they're not coming back. Let's get you that ice cream, huh?" Lily nodded, her face lighting up at the mention of ice cream, and Mark felt a small sense of relief wash over him. For her, the situation was already forgotten. She was too young to fully understand what had happened, and Mark wanted to keep it that way, for now. But Sarah, standing a few yards away near the edge of the playground, was far from forgetting. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, her breath shallow as she watched Mark place Lily into the back seat of his car. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind. The way Mark had reacted, the calmness in his voice, the tender care he showed Lily. Everything about it screamed that he was just a father spending a day with his daughter. And yet, she had been so sure, so convinced that something was wrong. Had she let her own biases take over? Had she overreacted? The question echoed in her mind, gnawing at her conscience. She watched as Mark started the car, preparing to drive off, and a deep pit of guilt settled in her stomach. She had caused this, caused the disruption, the embarrassment, the unnecessary confrontation. What if she had been wrong all along? The bystanders who had gathered during the confrontation had already started to drift away, the tension fading as quickly as it had arrived. Some of them glanced at Sarah with raised eyebrows, but most didn't say anything. A few parents gave Mark sympathetic nods as they passed by, offering smiles of reassurance. Mark returned the nods, grateful but also exhausted. He was used to it, too used to it. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Sarah felt a wave of panic rising in her chest. She had to know. She had to be sure. She hurried across the park toward her own car, her thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and confusion. She couldn't just let it go. What if she had been right to be suspicious? What if something was truly wrong? But deep down, Sarah knew that her gut feeling had been based on nothing more than a deep-seated fear she had never fully examined. She fumbled with her keys as she got into her car, her hands still shaking as she started the engine. She had to follow them. She needed to see if Mark and Lily really were going to get ice cream, or if something more sinister was happening. It was the only way to put her mind at ease. Mark, unaware of Sarah's internal turmoil, drove in silence. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Lily, who was humming to herself in the back seat, her earlier fall already forgotten. His mind, however, was far from calm. He hated that this was their reality, that he had to constantly be on guard, even in a place as innocent as a park. He hated that he carried those adoption papers with him like a shield, knowing that without them, his bond with Lily would always be questioned by strangers who didn't understand. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. Today wasn't about that. Today was about Lily and making sure she had a good time. He pulled into the parking lot of a small ice cream shop at the edge of town, one they frequented on sunny afternoons like this. He parked the car, stepping out and walking around to help Lily out of her seat. "Ready for your treat?" he asked, smiling as he unbuckled her. Lily grinned and nodded enthusiastically, hopping out of the car and grabbing his hand as they walked toward the shop. The bell over the door jingled as they stepped inside, and the familiar sweet smell of freshly made waffle cones filled the air. As they browsed the ice cream flavors, Sarah pulled into the parking lot, her hands clutching the steering wheel tightly. She spotted them through the shop's window, watching as Mark lifted Lily up so she could see the ice cream selection better. The guilt that had been slowly growing inside her suddenly surged. They looked like any other father and daughter, happy, carefree, loving. How could she have ever thought something was wrong? But the guilt was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. What had she done? She had called the police on an innocent man. She had disrupted their day, made him feel like a criminal in front of his daughter, all because of her own assumptions. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Inside the shop, Mark and Lily sat down at a small table by the window, their cones piled high with scoops of rainbow-colored ice cream. Lily giggled as a drip of melting ice cream slid down the cone, and Mark wiped it away with a napkin, laughing along with her. Sarah sat frozen in her car, watching them through the glass. She wanted to go in, to apologize, to explain herself. But what could she possibly say? How could she take back what she had done? She slumped back in her seat, her mind swirling with regret and shame. The realization that her actions had been driven by nothing but her own unfounded fear was a bitter pill to swallow. She had called the police on a man who had done nothing wrong, all because he didn't fit the image she had in her mind of what a father and daughter should look like. Mark looked out the window, catching a glimpse of Sarah sitting in her car. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah's heart sank. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised, just tired, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, as if it was just another part of his life, one he had no choice but to accept. Sarah tore her gaze away, her stomach churning. She had made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. Mark held Lily's hand as they left the ice cream shop, her sticky fingers wrapped around his. Her bright smile and the way she swung her cone happily from side to side were enough to lift Mark's spirits, at least for the moment. But as he helped her back into the car and closed the door, he felt the familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders. He glanced across the parking lot and noticed Sarah still sitting in her car, her face pale, her body stiff. The moment their eyes had met earlier, he had known. It was her. She was the one who had made that call. There had been hesitation in her face, regret even, but it didn't erase what she had done. Mark sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as the emotional exhaustion from the afternoon hit him all at once. He knew people like Sarah, well-meaning in their own minds, thinking they were protecting someone, doing their duty. But what they didn't realize was the harm they caused. The harm they kept causing, again and again. His mind flashed back to moments from his past. The cashier at the grocery store who questioned him about Lily's hair, as if a black father couldn't know how to care for his white daughter. The neighbor who looked at him sideways every time they were in the elevator together. The questions, the doubts, the stares, it was always there. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly for a moment before starting the engine. He wanted to drive away, to leave the entire experience behind him, but something made him pause. Lily was buckled up in the back, singing a little tune to herself, blissfully unaware of the weight of the world her father was carrying. But Mark knew that wouldn't always be the case. One day, Lily would grow older, and she'd start to notice the stares. She'd hear the whispers and feel the cold eyes of judgment, and Mark wouldn't always be able to shield her from it. He wouldn't always be able to protect her from the way the world saw them. Sarah watched as Mark sat in the car, unmoving, her breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to go up to him, to apologize, but her legs felt like lead. She knew she had to make this right, but how? How could she fix the damage she had done? After a long moment, she unbuckled her seatbelt, stepped out of the car, and started walking toward him. Her heart pounded in her chest. each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the driver's side window, she tapped lightly on the glass. Mark glanced up, surprised to see her standing there. He rolled down the window, his expression guarded but calm. "Yes?" he asked, his voice steady. "I?" Sarah stammered, struggling to find the words. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that she was standing in front of him, everything she had planned to say vanished. She took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize." Mark raised an eyebrow, his face neutral but expectant. He didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. "I was the one who called the police," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. I thought I was doing the right thing. I don't know what I thought." She ran a hand through her hair, her guilt spilling over into every word. "I saw you and your daughter, and I jumped to conclusions. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have, and I'm so sorry." Mark didn't respond right away. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He had heard apologies like this before, people who realized too late the damage they had caused. But there was something in Sarah's eyes that made him pause. She wasn't just sorry for the inconvenience. She was grappling with something deeper, something she had never fully confronted until now. After a long silence, Mark finally spoke. "You don't know how often this happens," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an underlying sadness. "You don't know how often I have to explain myself, carry around proof of my fatherhood, just in case someone decides I don't look like I belong with my daughter." Sarah winced at his words, the full weight of what she had done settling on her shoulders. She had never considered what it must be like for him, to constantly live under a microscope, to always have to justify something as simple as being a father. "I didn't mean to," she began, but Mark cut her off, not unkindly. "I know you didn't mean to," he said, "but you did it anyway, and that's the problem." He leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. "It's not just about what you intended. It's about the impact, the assumptions you made. They could have led to something much worse." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her guilt overwhelming her. She had thought she was protecting a child, but in reality, she had put that child's father in a dangerous situation. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." Mark's gaze softened, though the hurt still lingered. "That's the thing, though. You didn't know, but you assumed. And that's where people go wrong. They assume the worst because of what they see on the outside. They assume because I'm black, I don't belong with my own daughter. You're not the first person to think that, and you probably won't be the last." Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding. She had heard stories about incidents like this, but she had never imagined she would be the one perpetuating the problem. "I wish I could take it back," she said softly. Mark shook his head, a faint, tired smile appearing on his face. "You can't, but you can learn from it, and maybe next time you won't jump to conclusions. Maybe next time you'll see things for what they really are, not what you think they might be." Sarah swallowed hard, the knot in her throat tightening. "I will," she promised. "I will." Mark nodded, and for a brief moment they stood in a shared silence, one filled with understanding, regret, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Sarah had made a mistake, but perhaps by facing it head-on, she could begin to make amends. "Take care of your daughter," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, before turning and walking away. Mark watched her go, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Lily, still singing quietly to herself, oblivious to the world outside. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, his thoughts heavy, but his heart just a little lighter. Mark drove in silence, the events of the day weighing heavily on him as he navigated the familiar streets back home. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her ice cream cone long forgotten, her small body curled up in the seatbelt. Her soft, rhythmic breathing was the only sound in the car, and Mark found some comfort in that. But his mind was still racing. He replayed the conversation with Sarah over and over, wondering if anything had really changed. Would Sarah truly learn from this? Would she pause the next time she saw something that didn't fit her narrow expectations? Or was this just another apology that would be forgotten by the time she reached her front door? Mark had heard so many words of regret before, but the weight of the world rarely shifted. The neighborhood came into view, and Mark slowed the car as they approached their house. The street was quiet, as it usually was in the late afternoon, with a few neighbors tending to their lawns or walking their dogs. He spotted Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor from across the street, watering her rose bushes. She gave a small wave as he pulled into the driveway, and Mark waved back with a tired smile. He parked the car and gently unbuckled Lily, careful not to wake her as he scooped her up in his arms. She stirred a little, mumbling something incoherent before settling her head on his shoulder. Mark carried her inside, placing her softly on the couch before covering her with a blanket. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her sleep, the innocence of her childhood still untouched by the harsh realities that surrounded them. But he knew that wouldn't last forever. One day, Lily would be old enough to understand. She would start asking questions about why people looked at them the way they did, why strangers made assumptions, why her father had to carry adoption papers just to prove he was her parent. Mark didn't know how he would answer those questions when the time came. But for now, he was grateful that she could still find peace in the simple joys of life. After making sure Lily was comfortable, Mark stepped outside to get some air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the neighborhood. He leaned against the porch railing, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His thoughts drifted back to Sarah. He wondered what she was feeling now, whether she was wrestling with the same guilt and regret she had shown earlier. Part of him hoped that she had gone home and truly reflected on her actions, on the assumptions she had made. But another part of him knew that this wasn't just about one person. It was bigger than Sarah. It was about a society that continually saw him, saw people like him, not as they were, but as stereotypes, as threats, as something that didn't fit. He thought about all the times he had been questioned, all the times he had felt eyes on him, doubting, judging, and he thought about how tired he was of carrying that weight. How tired he was of always having to prove that he was worthy, that he belonged. The creak of the front gate broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Mrs. Henderson making her way toward him, her steps slow but steady. She was holding a basket of freshly picked tomatoes, her usual gift whenever her garden produced more than she could eat. "Evening, Mark," she called as she approached, her smile warm and genuine. "Thought you might want some tomatoes. The garden's been overflowing this week." Mark smiled, grateful for the distraction. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. You're too kind." She waved him off with a chuckle. "It's nothing, dear. Just don't let them go to waste now." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the evening settling around them. Henderson glanced at the house, her eyes softening as she saw Lily through the window, still asleep on the couch. "She's getting so big," she said quietly. "Every time I see her, she's grown a little more. You're doing a good job with her, Mark. A real good job." Mark nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice low. Mrs. Henderson looked at him for a long moment, her gaze filled with a kind of understanding that went beyond words. "You know, people can be foolish sometimes," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "They make judgments they've got no right to make. But don't let it get you down, son. You're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask for." Mark felt the weight of her words settle over him like a comforting blanket. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that until she said it. He gave her a small smile, grateful for her kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means a lot." She patted his arm before turning to leave. "You take care now, and if you need anything, you just holler." Mark watched her go, her small frame disappearing through the gate. He stood there for a moment longer, the evening air cool against his skin, feeling a sense of calm begin to return. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe all he could do was keep going, keep doing his best, and hope that the world would eventually catch up. Inside, Lily stirred on the couch, her little voice calling for him. Mark smiled as he went back inside, ready to be her father for another day, no matter what the world might throw at them. Mark sat down on the couch next to Lily, gently brushing a stray curl from her face. She blinked awake, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and she smiled up at him. "Hey, sleepyhead, Mark whispered with a grin. "You had quite the day?" Lily rubbed her eyes and yawned. "Did we get the ice cream?" she asked, her voice groggy but curious. Mark chuckled. "We did. You ate it all, remember?" Lily giggled and nodded, snuggling up next to him. Mark held her close, feeling the weight of the day slowly slip away as he sat there with her, surrounded by the quiet of their home. Moments like these, with just the two of them, made everything feel worth it. The challenges, the stares, the questions, it all faded when he had Lily in his arms. "Daddy," Lily asked after a pause, her voice soft but thoughtful. "Why did the police come today?" Mark's chest tightened at her question. He had hoped she wouldn't bring it up, but he knew it was inevitable. Lily was getting older, and her curiosity was growing along with her. He took a deep breath, thinking carefully about how to explain. "Sometimes," he began slowly, "people don't understand things they see. They make mistakes because they don't know the whole story." Lily tilted her head, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" Mark smiled gently, stroking her hair as he spoke. "Well, today, someone saw us at the park, and they didn't understand that we're a family. They thought something was wrong when really everything was just fine. The police came because they wanted to make sure you were okay." Lily's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of confusion and concern crossing her face. "But you're my daddy. Why wouldn't they know that?" Mark sighed softly, his heart aching at the innocence in her voice. He wished it were that simple, that the world could see what was so clear to her, but he knew it wasn't. "Sometimes people don't see things the way we do, sweetheart, and when they don't understand, they can make mistakes." Lily thought about that for a moment, then snuggled closer to him. "But I know you're my daddy," she said firmly, her little voice filled with conviction. Mark smiled, a warmth spreading through him at her words. "That's all that matters," he said softly, kissing the top of her head. "That's all that matters." They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the day slowly lifting. Mark knew that one day he would have to explain more. He would have to talk to her about the world, about the complexities of race and identity, about the assumptions people made. But for now, he was content to let her live in her innocence for just a little longer. As they sat together, a knock on the door startled them both. Mark glanced up, his heart quickening for a moment, but when he opened the door, he was surprised to see Sarah standing on the porch. She was holding something in her hand, her expression a mixture of nervousness and resolve. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to come by and bring this." She held out a small bouquet of flowers, the petals delicate and brightly colored. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to do something, to apologize." Mark hesitated for a moment, then reached out to take the flowers. He looked at them, then back at Sarah, who was shifting uncomfortably on the porch, clearly unsure of what to say next. "I've been thinking about what happened," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about it all day, and I realized I've never really questioned the way I see the world before. I've never thought about how much harm my assumptions could cause. But today I did, and I'm sorry, Mark. I really am." Mark studied her for a moment, searching her face for any sign of insincerity, but all he saw was genuine regret. He nodded slowly, appreciating her willingness to confront her own biases, even if it had taken a difficult experience to bring them to the surface. "Thank you," he said simply. "I appreciate that." Sarah smiled weakly, the relief visible on her face. I want to do better. I want to learn. And if there's anything I can do to help, to make up for what I did, please let me know." Mark nodded again, feeling a small sense of hope stirring within him. It wasn't often that people admitted their mistakes, much less tried to make amends. Maybe this was a step in the right direction. Maybe change, even if slow and painful, was possible. "I'll hold you to that," Mark said with a gentle smile. "We all have a lot to learn." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered again before turning to leave. As she walked away, Mark stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her go. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a while he felt a flicker of optimism. He turned back inside, holding the flowers in his hand. Lily looked up from the couch, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Who was that, Daddy?" Mark smiled softly, walking over to her and placing the flowers on the table. Just someone who wanted to say sorry, he said. Lily looked at the flowers, then back at him, her smile wide and innocent. They're pretty, she said. Yeah, Mark replied, sitting down beside her. They are. As the evening sun cast a warm glow over their home, Mark felt a sense of peace settle in. Today had been hard, but it had also been a day of growth. For him, for Sarah, and for Lily. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.